Hello, and welcome to the third lesson of the 2D to 3D course. In this lesson, we'll cover spline modeling. Let's get started. Model creation using this method can be divided into two stages. The first one is creating splines. The second one is creating models with spline-based generators. There are several ways to create splines. The first way to do this is by using spline primitives. They can be found here in this command panel and are marked in blue. Take a look at these primitives. The spline primitive object is no different from other objects. It also has basic options in the first two tabs. The Object tab has certain spline settings. So in this case, we have the Arc object. It has several types: arc, sector, segment, and ring. The settings are slightly different for each mode. But in general, we can change the radius, the start and end points of the spline, and the orientation in space. The Circle object. It can create circles, ellipses, and their modifications. The Helix object. The only spline object that works in 3D space, and not in 2 dimensions. It has various settings for radii, the number of twists, and so on. The N-side object. This object creates a closed spline with sharp or rounded corners. For rounding, you need to check the rounding parameter. The radius parameter will also become active. It is responsible for the radius of the rounding. The Rectangle object. We can adjust the dimensions along 2 axes as well as round the corners. Star object. It has settings for the outer and inner radius, the number of points, and a twist that lets you twist the object a little. Text object. This object allows you to create words, phrases, sentences, or text blocks. To do this, you need to set the text in the corresponding text box. It can be found in the Object tab. In this field, you can type in your text. Next, select a font, set font size, and other text settings. There are also kerning settings, but it is better not to change them so as not to spoil the font. The Four-side object. This object allows you to create quadrangles of various shapes. It has several types: diamond, kite, parallelogram, and trapezium. The Cissoid object. It allows you to create a variety of mathematical curves. The Cogwheel object. It allows you to create a variety of gears and spoked wheels. It has a fairly large number of controllers with which you can interactively adjust the parameters. Cycloid object. It creates such curves and has several modes as well as various options to customize them. The Formula object. This object creates a spline based on the result of a mathematical function, flower. It has only a few settings, namely for outer and inner radius, number of petals, and orientation in space. The Profile object. This object creates various profiles. In its settings, you can find the types of the profiles and resizing parameters. All spline primitives can be converted to editable splines using the makeEditable command. Then switch to the point editing mode and modify the spline if required. The next way to create spline objects is spline draw. With this method, you create editable splines by hand drawing them. There are several tools for this in Cinema 4D. Spline Pen. After selecting this tool, its settings are displayed in the Attribute Manager. In it, we can set the type of the spline we want to create. Of course, it can be configured directly in the object itself, but we'll talk about this later. By default, the tool is set to the Bezier type. With this type enabled, let's cover what Spline Pen does. First, you need to decide in which plane you'll be creating splines, as this is quite problematic to do in a perspective view. For example, I'll dop this in the XY plane, in the front view. After switching to it, left-click to create a spline point. If we click again in a different location, a new point is created. But this segment is linear. In order to get a point with Bezier handles, you need to hold down the left mouse button and drag. This way you can customize the shape of the spline. To disable the tool, press Escape. Note that tool tips appear next to the cursor. If you hover over an empty spot, an icon for creating a new spline appears. This means you can create many splines in the same object. But that won't always be the right thing to do. To create a spline as a new object, you need to deselect the spline object by clicking on an empty space in the Object Manager. The spline is now created in a new object. When you hover over a spline point, a point transformation hint appears. By selecting it, the Bezier handles setting appears. If you right-click on the selected point, a menu with the following settings appears. Here we can delete, detach, change the interpolation of points. If you want to continue drawing in the same spline, click on the extreme point and continue creating new ones. When we hover over the extreme point, a circle icon appears, which means that the spline is closed. Pay attention to the color of the spline. It has a gradient from white to blue. The white part is the beginning and the blue one is the end of the spline. Let's move on to the spline object itself. Like other objects in Cinema 4D, it has basic parameters displayed in the first two tabs. In the Basic tab, we can change the color of the spline so that it is clearly visible in the viewport. In the Coord tab, there are settings for the position, rotation, and size of the spline object. In the Object tab, you can set the spline type, as well as intermediate points. Also, the editable spline can be adjusted using the Move, Scale, and Rotate tools. This works both locally by selecting the desired points or area, and for the entire object. We can enable various snapping modes, change the axis position for certain needs, but each time it will be reset to 0. As I said, we can change the type of the spline directly in its settings. So we've covered the Bezier type. Let's take a look at the linear type. It is the simplest one. All spline joints are smooth. They have no roundings and no interpolators. The cubic, Acima, and B-spline type. These three modes are similar as they all create smooth transitions between points. Each type creates roundings differently. B-spline, unlike the first two, creates a curve that does not go through the anchor points and also has a more pronounced rounding. Bezier we have already considered. It has customizable interpolators. It has the close spline function. Turning it off will connect the extreme points. We will talk about the intermediate points settings a little later. Let's talk about point editing tools. As I already mentioned, by selecting the spline point and right-clicking, a commands menu pops up. For this to work, the Spline Pen tool must be selected. If we right-click in an empty space, a menu with spline editing tools pops up. The first two commands allow you to customize the interpolation of the selected points. The next two allow you to edit the interpolators. So the first parameter adjusts the length of the short handle, according to the longer one. The second parameter adjusts the corner. Join segment allows you to join multiple spline segments that are in one object. Break segment, respectively, breaks the spline into segments. When there are multiple disconnected segments in an object, explode segments becomes active. It allows you to convert each spline segment into a separate object. Point order allows you to set the first point of the spline, reverse the points, or offset it. The first point of the spline is important for various calculations and generations. The following command has a tab with Boolean operations. To enable it, you need a pair of closed editable splines. By selecting them and choosing the command, a new spline object is created with the command executed. Create point command allows you to create new points on the spline without changing its shape. Next are the drawing tools. We've already covered spline pen, and we will talk about the rest a bit later. The next tool is chamfer. With this tool, you can quickly create smooth roundings. Select the points that need to be chamfered. Select this tool. Its settings are displayed in the Attribute Manager. Adjust the radius and click the Apply button, or hold down the left mouse button on an empty spot in the viewport. Drag the mouse to the right without releasing it. This way we manually set the size of the chamfer. Note that if you release the mouse and start over, the chamfers will be created on top of the previous chamfers. We can also set a chamfer without rounding by turning on flat. Create Outline tool has radius settings, and using it you can create an outline in a new object. By default, it is created in the original one. Round allows you to split the spline into a specified number of points. In this case, they will be rounded depending on the selected type. For example, I'll create an object from straight lines. Select the tool. It has points and type parameters. After configuring them, click Apply. Now we can change the number of points, and they will be added in real time. It is also used to reduce the number of points on the spline. For example, we have this spline with a huge number of points. To reduce their number, I apply round. Notably, we can do this locally by selecting a certain segment of the spline. The Line Cut tool allows you to cut splines by creating additional points on them. The Line Up command. Selecting a spline segment and applying the command, the points align into a line, creating a straight segment. In this case, the tool is guided by the extreme selected points. The magnet allows you to move the points of the spline. Project. This function allows you to create projections of splines onto the surface of objects. To do this, place a shape under the spline. Select the projection type and click Apply. And the spline is projected. You can use it to move some objects along the surfaces onto which the spline is projected. The next tool is Mirror, and it allows you to enable symmetry. To do this, select the required elements, select the tool, and set the symmetry parameters. It is more convenient for me to work in the screen mode. For vertical symmetry, you need left-click closer to the left or the right edge of the preview window. After it, a vertical line appears. Drag it to the spline, release the button, and symmetry is achieved. Accordingly, for horizontal symmetry, left-click closer to the top or the bottom of the window. Let's create a curved spline for the next tool. I will select a couple of points. And here's the Weld tool. Use it to merge two or more points into one. If I select the entire spline, it will also merge into one point. The next one is the Disconnect tool. It disconnects the selected areas of the spline. Dissolve detaches it and places it into a new object. Note that the spline is connected in the original object. And the last one is the Subdivided command. It allows you to create a uniform subdivision of existing splines or their segments. Every time you use the tool, all points are split, by default, into two. By clicking on this gear, you can adjust the number of subdivisions. All these tools work with editable splines. Naturally, not all of them are commonly used. Let's take a look at a couple more tools for creating splines. The Sketch tool. It allows you to draw with splines directly in the viewport. It has settings that affect the drawing of the spline. It is more suitable for those who use tablets. After pressing Shift, the Spline Smooth tool appears, which you can use to smooth out all the rough places. You can also access it in the command panel. The next one is the Spline Arc tool. This tool allows you to create rounded shapes or smoothly connect splines. Now let's talk about another way of creating splines. That is, import from AI. If you need to import splines from Adobe Illustrator, there are several ways to do it. Let me demonstrate this using a logo as an example. The first way is to save the desired spline file in the old Illustrator 8 format. In this case, Cinema 4D will be able to recognize splines. Next, we import the file to the 3D package by dragging and dropping it into the viewport or via the File menu Merge Object. A window with import settings appears, in which we can set the size. But in fact, it is easier to later select the splines and adjust the dimensions to fit the objects in the scene. The second way is to import it via the CV Art Smart plugin. It's quite old, but free, and it works well. After installation, open Illustrator, select the splines you need and copy them. Go to Cinema 4D, go to Extensions, and press the CV Art Smart Paste button. An object with splines is created with the same hierarchy as in Illustrator. The advantages of this method is that you can quickly edit splines, copy them, and paste the desired areas. For example, I will select a few letters, copy them, and paste them into Cinema 4D. The plugin also allows you to export from Cinema 4D to Illustrator. For example, let's create a spline. Select ArtSmart Copy, go to Illustrator, and click Paste. To learn more about the plugin functions, you can go to the Cineversity website. The link is in the lesson's description. Another interesting way to create splines is Edge to Spline. To use this method, you select the faces of a polygonal object in the face editing mode. Right-click on an empty spot to access a context menu. Please note that this context menu will be different for each mode. In the Model Edit mode, it will display the commands related to the model. In polygon editing mode, it will display commands and tools related to polygon editing, and so on. Let's go back to the face editing mode. Select the edges. Right-click on an empty spot. Select the Edge to Spline command. This creates a spline child object that follows the shape of the selected faces. Objects can be of any type, and you can select all the faces and create a shell. It will be cumbersome to do such a thing manually. The next way to create splines is using spline mask. This generator works in the same way as the Boolean one. Using it, we can perform various Boolean operations with spline primitives or editable splines. Let's create some spline primitives. Now put them into the generator. Take a look at the generator modes. Union mode. It unites all the splines so that we get a single contour. Mode A subtract B. From the topmost spline in the hierarchy, the splines that are below it will be cut. B subtract A. The topmost spline in the hierarchy will be cut from the lower splines in the hierarchy. The next mode is AND. It creates the intersection of splines A and B. OR. It is the opposite of the AND mode. The intersection of splines A and B are cut, and the remaining segments are retained. To see this, enable the Create Cap mode. And the last mode is Intersection. Intersection is a combination of and OR modes. Let's cover a few more generators that allow you to create splines. They are related to the MoGraph module. These are Tracer and MoSpline. Tracer. This generator creates splines based on the points of objects or particles. In the Object tab, there is a field that stores the objects based on which the generator works. It has several modes. Let's take a look at Trace Paths. Let's create a cube. Add a vibrate tag to it and make the cube move. When we're playing the animation, we see that the cube is moving. Now, if I put it in the generator, we can see how the path is created. By default, a path is created for each point in the model. If you turn off Trace Vertices, the spline is created based on the center of the object. The tracer object can be converted to a primitive, changed into a spline object. I'll stop the animation and use the Make Editable command. But before that, we set the spline settings. I'll set the type to Bezier and intermediate points to Adaptive. A little later, I will tell you what this means. Click the Make Editable button. The path has been converted to a spline. This spline has many points, and it will be problematic to edit it. We can round it with the Round command. Set the spline type, the number of points, and click Apply. The spline is now rounded. In this case, it is based on the spline settings that we set to the generator. The next mode is Connect All Objects. It connects the centers of objects into a single spline. Let's create some null objects. I will give them a color, shape, and place them in space. Now we put the objects into the generator in the order in which we want to connect them. Since the hierarchy is ordered downwards, the topmost object is the first point of the spline. Now let's move on to the spline settings in the generator. Set the type and intermediate points. It is also possible to close the spline. The good thing about this method is that null objects are easier to control and animate than spline points. MoSpline. The MoSpline object is a spline generator. It has three modes. The simple mode. In this mode, a straight line spline is generated. In the same tab, you can find settings for the generated spline. Start and offset. For those who have worked in After Effects, pay attention that they are like the trim path effect. The next tab is responsible for spline settings. We can set its length, change the angle, adjust the curvature, and so on. The next tab is Effectors. In it, we can influence the spline with effectors, and this applies to all generator modes. For example, by adding the Formula effector, we get an animated wave. The next mode is Spline. It allows you to generate a MoSpline based on a spline primitive or an editable spline. So let's create a spline as an example. There are only a few settings in the Spline tab. An object is added to the source spline parameter, along which the path will be generated. The source rail is a guide spline that will affect the alignment of the MoSpline. There is also a thickness setting. And the last one is the Turtle mode. It allows you to create such things that look like tree branches. There are many different settings in this mode, and it is also possible to generate such things using code. That's all for creating splines. Also, to create more interesting shapes, you can apply various deformers to them. For example, add a bend deformer on Helix. Adjust it, and in this way you can deform splines. Now let's talk a little about spline segmentation, or intermediate points. This is what I mean. Create a spline, and to show the subdivision, I will add it to the extrude generator. We will cover it in more detail a little later. Turn on the Gouraud shading lines mode, and we see the segmentation of the model that the spline is responsible for. You can adjust it with the intermediate points parameter. The None mode connects the spline points with straight lines with no additional subdivisions and rounding, regardless of the selected spline type. Natural is the interpolation type that splits each spline segment into the same number of points. For example, I will add a point at this point. This segment now has the same number of subdivisions as the others. This number of subdivisions is set in the number parameter. Uniform sets uniform spline segmentation. The number of points on the spline is not taken into account. Subdivisions are also configured in the number parameter. Adaptive is the standard mode. This type of interpolation creates intermediate points when the tangent deviates by a specified angle. This can be adjusted by the angle parameter. Subdivided works similarly to the previous one, but it allows you to configure additional subdivisions in accordance with the maximum length parameter. We can also convert the edited spline into an object that will be subdivided by these settings. To do this, select the spline and right-click. Apply the current state command to Object. This feature can be useful. Spline segmentation directly affects your model. We will now consider this using generators for the demonstration purposes. So let's cover the generators for spline modeling. Please remember that they are in this command panel. Let's talk about them in order. So the Extrude tool first. For it to work, you need to add the spline to a parent object. It can be a closed spline, an open one, or several objects in one. An object that is smaller and located inside will be rendered as a whole. We can combine multiple spline objects using the Connect generator or using the Spline Mask generator for it. The Extrude generator in the Object tab has extrusion settings. Direction is responsible for the plane in which the object will be extruded. Automatic mode does this well. The offset parameter controls the depth of the extrusion. In the subdivision parameter, set the segmentation based on the extrusion depth. The next one is the Caps tab. We can turn off caps to get an extruded outline. Below are the bevel settings. With the separate bevel controls mode enabled, we can set different bevel values. At the very bottom, there is an especially important caps type setting. When you deform the generated object, in most cases you will need to add segments to the caps. For this, select the regular grid mode. Open its settings and set the mesh to about the same size as most of the polygons on your model. In my case, the object is quite simple, so it has few subdivisions. Now I will add some more for demonstration purposes. Select the spline primitive and adjust the intermediate points. Now if we place the generator in one object with a deformer, we can change its shape. If we set caps back to n-gon polygon, the object will break. Consider the case when you need to place several spline objects in a generator. If I just add them as children, the generator will be applied to the topmost one. For both to work, you can convert them into a single spline object. With them selected, right-click and select the Connect Object plus Delete command. This creates an editable spline. Note that the smaller object acts as a whole. The second way is that we add objects to the Connect generator. And one more way is to add splines to the spline mask generator. The only thing in it is to select the correct mode. Next generator, lathe. The generator rotates the spline around its y-axis. As a rule, the spline should be in the xy plane. Create a spline. It will be half of the vase. We've got the following object. Put it into the generator. The points that will be in the center mean that in this place the object will be closed. Such models are very quick to edit. So select part of the spline and adjust the points. The Object tab has settings for object rotation and vertical subdivisions. Horizontal subdivisions in this case are affected by the spline settings. Next tool, Loft. The Loft object creates a general shell over splines located in a certain sequence. Splines should be placed alternately both in the hierarchy and in a 3D space. Let me create some spline primitives. I will arrange them in space alternately, just like in the hierarchy. Put the objects into the generator, and we get the following model. In the Object tab, the generator has subdivision settings. The Caps tab has the same settings as other generators. And the last, Sweep Spline generator. The Sweep object must have two splines to work. The first spline is a contour that defines the cross-section of the object's shell. The second spline defines the path or direction along which the first spline will be moved. There are some interesting features in the generator settings. We can adjust end scale, end rotation, start growth, and end growth. The start and end of the spline is determined directly by the spline itself. As you remember, it has a gradient. White defines the start and blue defines the end of the spline. Below in this tab, there are graphs you can use to adjust the scale and rotation of the model. 0 defines the start of the spline, and 1 defines the end. In the Caps tab, as always, you can enable caps and set the bevel. Model segmentation is specified in splines. Great. We've learned about the spline modeling tools. Let's cement our knowledge in practice. In the next part of the lesson, we will create several models using these tools.